This is our board work of the last few days. We've been speaking about the ploughing of the world, our last dispensation of 14 to 19. To construct this model, we took what we knew well. What we know fairly well right now is the ploughing of the priests and the latter rain of the priests. And we need both models to teach us of this history. I just want to remind us of the difficult point that I asked everyone to keep in mind yesterday when we're discussing someone like Michael Moore. What was that difficult point? One of the most challenging things that we have to do. But if we don't do it, we continually make mistakes. Sister Joy, do you remember that? Yes. So Michael Moore threading him from 1989, because while this is the priests specifically, we know that this first history, it's the beginning of the 144,000. Michael Moore is relevant to that history, so you must be able to thread him all the way from 1989. But as Sister Joy said, he also has a specific function in ploughing the Nethinims. What does Moore mean? Michael Moore. What does the Moore part of his name mean? What is a Moore? M-O-O-R-E. Does anyone know what Moore means? Sorry? Uncultivated land. What do you take from that, Brother Festus? That which has not been ploughed? Fallow ground? Sorry? I don't think we would take it that far. If you would go to England, they would talk about the moors. And it's just large areas of ground that hasn't been cultivated. But it doesn't mean that it will be cultivated or ploughed. So even when we come to his name, we find a reference to this history, even back 2004, before this ground begins to be ploughed, right when it's you could say a moor or an unworked ground. From the beginning, that's where his work begins. Back in 2004, could take him from 1989, but we know that he has a specific function as the messenger, ploughing messenger of the Nethinims, particularly marking him from 2014, Flint, Michigan. But also back to this 10-year history before, where you could say the ground has not yet been touched. It's unploughed, unworked ground. Fahrenheit 9/11, 2004, when they should be starting to wake up. So we drew these two opposite sides. You have, on one side, Steve Bannon, and on the other side, Michael Moore. And we're all content to see those two opposite sides developing two narratives for the American people, the public. Does that make sense? So once we discussed the history of their ploughing, we came to the history of their harvest. We have our 5 primary waymarks for the world: 2014, 2019, 2021, Daniel 11:41, Daniel 12:1. We know these most commonly as Panium, Sunday law, close of probation. But we know that the Sunday law for the world is 2021. So we asked what this period of harvest looks like, and we had a few different thoughts from the class about what type of message we bring them, what composes it. When we go to the world, do we bring to them everything, every requirement from diet to dress, all of these different subjects? Or do we bring them just the testing message of their dispensation? Is that all that they're required to accept? No other requirement to be part of this movement or enter heaven. Some people said no other requirement, that's all they need to be saved, this one test. Other people said they need everything, all truth. And people had, I think most everyone agreed that it would relate somehow to external events and an explanation of external events. There was some different ideas about what that would look like, really how religious that would look, how biblical, versus how prophetic in a more unbiblical sense, line upon line, World War I, World War II. So I think people have some disagreements there about what it looks like. What everyone agreed on was that it would be divided into two groups, the conservatives versus the liberals, as they see developing here in the ploughing history between the Steve Bannons and the Michael Moores. Does that make sense? Good so far. So what we did then is we left that, we put that to one side, and I had one sister say that it's problematic because it can seem like we're jumping from one subject to another and they're not related. So this is related. We're going to come around and connect. But I want us to go back and consider the counterfeit. We went right back to the beginning. War in heaven comes down onto this earth, develops into a proxy war between two kingdoms or two churches, the kingdom of God and the kingdom of Satan, the church of God, the church of Satan. We saw that represented in Daniel chapter 2 between a mountain, Israel, and Satan's kingdom, the statue, Babylon, Medo Persia, Greece, Rome. So we compared and contrasted Israel and these kingdoms. And when we look at ancient Israel, we looked at its dynamic, how it was this combination of church and state. We went to the history of Samuel, and we identified that it was a church-state relationship, Samuel being both the religious head of Israel, also the political leadership as well, encapsulated into one individual. We compared and contrasted that with the statue. We went back to the history of Medo Persia, we took Darius, and we went to Daniel 6 as an example of how he is both a king and a god. He's the religious head of Medo Persia, and he's also the state head, encapsulated into one person. But it is the church over the state. Church rules the state. Does that all make sense? So we have that counterfeit. Then we come into the history of Christ. And we saw that in the history of Christ, that there is a division here between church and state. Now we have the early church as led by the apostles, and it does not have state power. We could go back through this history and it makes perfect sense why the Pharisees and John the Baptist would expect that a deliverer is going to deliver them and return them to this model, a theocracy, church and state. It makes sense if you don't understand the rules of parable teaching. Christ came and upended all that and returned to this church power under the apostles, but they no longer had state power. So he has separated the two. We go to Satan's kingdom, and what are they then going to do? It's not going to look like Darius or Alexander, where there's a God king, is it? You're going to come down to the history of, what king did we discuss? What king was that? You can raise your hand. Sister Elizabeth. We discussed a king yesterday. We see Darius, he's a god king. He wears both hats. He signs as a decree as a god. When he's a king, he tries to abolish that decree, but he can't, because Darius as God has authority over Darius as king. That makes sense? We see God split his into separation of church and state, and then we come to the history where Satan is going to have to counterfeit that, because all he does is counterfeit what God does. So we discussed a king in this history. Do you remember who that was? Yes, in this history. King of the Franks. King of the Franks, the tribe, Clovis. So we discussed Clovis, and what did Clovis do? Sorry? Clovis? Does he have religious power or state power? And who was he given the religious power to? The Pope. So he has surrendered his religious power to the church. So we start to see in his history, and then through the 1260, that they're separate powers. You have the kings of Europe, purely state, the papacy, purely church. Woman riding the beast. We have that picture. So there's a division here from between church and state. Does that all make sense? Question. We marked this without being specific. We marked this as 34 AD. We understand it's progressive. But we marked 34 AD when probation officially ends for the institution of ancient Israel. How long does it take Satan to counterfeit it? In the history of Christ, there's a division between church and state. They're now two separate entities. How long does it take Satan to counterfeit that work? My brother at the back. I'm going to say roughly 500 years, because some people wanted to, but I agree with you. It's roughly 500 years. Can we see that? So God does a work, and then it takes Satan half a millennium to counterfeit it. 500 years. Can we all see that? So from the time of the great controversies beginning, Satan is counterfeited. God has a method of operating. That method of operating changes in the dispensation of Christ, and it takes Satan 500 years to the history of 538 to counterfeit that work. When we discuss the counterfeit, the study of the counterfeit that we do, we talk about 1798, is the beginning of modern Israel. When do we mark the beginning of modern Babylon? For those who know that study, when do we mark the beginning of modern Babylon? (1899). Now how long is it taking Satan to counterfeit? 100 years. Can we all see that? So we've gone from 500 years to 100 years. Now, Brother Rogers came to me before and asked if I'd seen an article recently, in the last couple of days, about how Benedict, former Pope Benedict, and Pope Francis are in public disagreement. Why do you find that significant, Brother Rogers? Why does that interest us in the papacy? Two streams of information? Anyone else? Brother?
Okay. Pope Francis is liberal, Benedict is conservative. So we can see that what we have been studying between liberals and conservative. Also inside Catholic is that point.
Two streams of information, my brother? Sister Solange, you're doing... Why is it of interest to us to see two popes? First time in 600 years there's been two living popes at the same time, and they're fighting. So you see the Catholic Church separating? Why does that become important to us? Why do we care? I couldn't hear you, sorry. Becomes quite a significant waymark. When did this begin? When did these two sides begin the first divisions? My brother. Sorry? After the what, sorry?
April 2019.
April 2019, didn't begin there. My brother? 2013. So 2013, what happens? So Benedict retires and Francis is elected. So you see a transition between two. And then how do they get along from 13 till now? First time in 600 years. Two popes living at the same time. And they're publicly fighting. That split in the Catholic Church you can trace back to 2013, the very election of Francis. Why is that of any significance to us? My brother. What's this date? On this side? On this side? When did this become inevitable? This transition from one leader to another? When could we have predicted this? Not just 2014, but the change in leadership. 2012. Because something happens in 2012 that becomes the catalyst for a change in leadership. Could say Moses hit the rock. And Miller rejected the message. However you want to see that. 2012 is the catalyst that brought us to 2014 and a change in leadership. 2012, there's a prediction that 2014 will be the Sunday law. Does Elder Jeff accept that prediction? Someone who wasn't here 2 Sabbaths ago, who did hear that prediction and accept it? We know that at the Sunday law, and we went through this when we did all our reform lines, at the Sunday law there is a transition in leadership, yes? We know that it's at that waymark, the midpoint, there is a transition in leadership. 2012, the Sunday law is predicted. So if we had have known our reform lines better, we could have understood there would be a transition in leadership here. But the leaders of this dispensation rejected the message. Comparing and contrasting, who did accept the message of time setting? Who knew that 2014 would be the Sunday law? Brother Dennis. The movement, because the movement is always right. Brother Robert. Who accepted the message of time setting? So someone stands up, Parminder, and says in 2 years' time will be the Sunday law. So this way, Mark, you know you see a transition in leadership. The majority of the people in the movement either reject that or aren't particularly aware of it. Comparing and contrasting, you come to 2013 and the counterfeit, there's a transition in leadership. Why would Satan cause a transition in leadership in his church? Brother Robert. Sorry? Can you see that this is a counterfeit of this?
Yes, it's mimicking.
Why would Satan counterfeit this if he rejected this? Parminder says 2014 Sunday law. Most people in the movement ignore it or reject it. And yet, a year ahead of schedule, Satan's already counterfeited the Sunday law. So who accepted it? Satan. So while we were all either rejecting it or blind to it, Satan knew that this prediction was correct, didn't he? Because we were about to have a transition in leadership. He got one jump ahead of us. And he already put the Catholic Church through that. This had begun in 2012, took us to 2014. In 2012, there's a scandal in the Vatican known as VatiLeaks. It's a scandal showing the mistakes and corruption within the Benedict papacy. So 2012 is the cause of this change in leadership. 2012 was also the cause in this change in leadership. This is the VatiLeaks scandal. Benedict can no longer pretend to keep control over his church. He doesn't feel like he can face this corruption, this huge scandal any longer. So I think one of the greatest scandals the Catholic Church has ever faced. If you aren't familiar with VatiLeaks, do look it up. And it's the cause of him to abdicate in 2013. 2014, Pope Francis begins remaking the Catholic Church. Important synod in 2014, where he starts to, if this connects your mind back to Trump, he starts to purge the Catholic Church of all cardinals, bishops opposed to him. So the only point I wanted to make out of that is this is 500 years to counterfeit, yes? This is 100 years to counterfeit. And now where are we? We're stepping on each other's toes if he's not getting the jump in front of us. Any questions or thoughts on that? Sister Solange. Did Satan know there would be a transition in leadership in 2014? Do you think Satan wants to wait for God to go first? You make the first move, I'll punch second. But if he already knows what that model is, Can't he get a jump on that? 2012 is the catalyst for this. You already know what's going to happen. 2012, he instantly sets in place the same thing in the Catholic Church. What will instigate Pope Benedict to resign. However badly he understood it, he knew to counterfeit it ahead of time. This was the 2012 was the catalyst for 2014. 2012 is the catalyst. Benedict just couldn't wait. He just goes. But you can still mark 2014 here because it's 2014 when Francis begins remaking the Catholic Church. He doesn't do much straight away. 2014 he starts his purge. Elder Parminder.
The question was, how can Satan do things before Christ? How can 13 come before 14? So if you think about the falsification of the second advent, Satan tries to give a false second advent before the real second advent. It's already written in great controversy. There's a false second advent. We all know that. We already have a witness that Satan, when he knows what's happening, he will try to do things before the genuine thing happens. It's not a new phenomenon that's being introduced there. I think the question was, how can he go before us? He has to follow us. But we know already at the end, he comes before Christ comes, because it's a full second advent. You can't give a second advent after the second advent wouldn't work. But we already know that it's not that unusual. It's not new.
It's a good question, and that's a good answer. So the question is, why would Satan counterfeit before the original has actually happened? The answer is what Elder Parminder gave, the example of Satan counterfeiting the second advent before the actual real second advent occurs. Because he knows in advance what's coming. He knows about the second advent. And when he knows about it, he's able to counterfeit it beforehand. Is that okay? Makes sense? And he's already preparing that work. When we think about the Sunday law, we're in a preparation to go to the world at the Sunday law. What is Protestantism going to do at the Sunday law? Go to the world, isn't it? So isn't he already preparing them for an event that hasn't yet happened, knowing prophetically it will? So all that we wanted to demonstrate from this is that we have 500 years it takes Satan to counterfeit, and then 100 years to counterfeit, and now we are overlapping each other. We're on top of each other. Do you know that we're heading for a direct collision at the Sunday law? They go to work, we go to work, at the same point in time. So I want to come back from this and briefly remind ourselves of the counterfeit. Going back to this model, modern Israel, modern Babylon. We've looked at ancient Israel, ancient Babylon, Medo Persia, Greece, Rome. Now we will review the modern history. So just to remind us, we have ancient Israel in how many steps? Alpha and Omega, beginning and end. Modern Israel. In how many histories? An alpha history. It goes into a Laodicean condition. Omega history. This one begins in 1798. This one begins in 1989. So modern Israel in two histories, Alpha from 1798, Omega from 1989. We're okay with that? So when we talk about modern Babylon, it must just be a counterfeit of modern Israel, yes? So how many histories? It must have an alpha history and an omega history. And between them, they must go back into a scattering time. So an alpha history and an omega history. If you haven't seen this study before and you're confused, this is just Millerites and 144,000 are two reform lines, Daniel 11:40 part A, Daniel 11:40 part B. Time of the end, time of the end. That's how we construct modern Israel. Coming to modern Babylon must just be a counterfeit then of modern Israel, meaning that it must have an original alpha history, its beginning, then going into a Laodicean condition, and then again being gathered in its omega history. So we'll draw that up. Is everyone familiar with this study of the counterfeit? Is anyone not familiar? You're not familiar with it? Well, we'll revise it, and if one point confuses you, we can spend more time on it. If we were to construct the history of modern Israel, we would see that from 538 to 1798, what was the condition of God's people? 1260 years of scattering time, of captivity, yes? And then God is going to bring them out in 1798. And this is the beginning point of modern Israel. What does he do to bring them out? 3 angels' messages and raising up a messenger to deliver them. William Miller. So you have a messenger raised up to give the first angel's message. He's going to have an increase of knowledge until 1818. And it will be formalized in 1833. So in 1818, it's the whole message, everything that the Millerites are going to know in a condensed form. What does he say in 1818? In about 25 years, Christ will come back. So it's the whole message in a capsule form. In 1833, that's formalized. He begins to publicly preach and teach. From the time of his preaching, we know it swells until October 22, 1844. It's a 46-year history. And October 22, 1844, what is their experience? Sister, October 22, 1844, what is their experience? Sorry? Disappointed? Disappointment and failure. We're all okay with that. From October 22, 1844, they go back into a time period of scattering. When do they come out of that time period of scattering? So they're in a history of gathering for 46 years. They're scattered after October 22, and they're regathered in the history of 1850. And I want to read a few quotes. We'll just paraphrase from Review and Herald, November 1. Review and Herald, November 1, 1850, paragraph 9. She says that she had a revelation from God on September the 23rd. So her revelation was earlier, but she's recording it, sharing it on November the 1st. September the 23rd, the Lord showed me that he had stretched out his hand the second time to recover the remnant of his people. So if this is the second time, what must have happened before? The first time. So if God is stretching out to recover his people or to gather his people, in this history, he must have attempted to gather them before, yes? When? The 46 years. So he attempts to gather the remnant of his people here. They're scattered after October 22. And September, November of 1850, Ellen White is shown God is going to make a second attempt. She says in the scattering time, Israel was smitten and torn. When was the scattering time? (1844 to 1850). So she's saying late 1850. The Lord has showed me he's going to gather his people a second time, because he's attempted it once in the Millerite history, and the efforts must be doubled. In the scattering time after October 22, Israel was smitten and torn. But now in the gathering time, 1850, God will heal and bind up his people. Efforts made to spread the truth in the scattering time had little effect after October 22, but now in the gathering time, 1850, God has set his hand to gather his people, and efforts to spread the truth will have their designed effect. Does that make sense? I've put some of my own words in there to clarify the English. You can go through the quote yourself, but what she's saying is that there is two periods of gathering time separated by a period of scattering. The two times of gathering are from 1798 to 1844. Then Israel was smitten and torn by the disappointment of October 22. Now God is going to attempt again to gather his people in the history of 1850. Is that all clear?
Yes.
Paragraph 10. The Lord showed me that the 1843 chart was directed by the hand of God. So on the same day, she's going to state that this chart, the 1843 chart of this history, was directed by the hand of God. This is where we say that she gives her stamp of approval to the 1843 chart. The Lord showed me that the 1843 chart was directed by his hand and that no part of it should be altered, that the figures were as he wanted them. Going to another quote that she writes on the same day, November 1st of 1850. You'll find this one in Manuscript Releases, Volume 5, 5MR 202.4. 5MR 202.4. She's writing a letter to brother and sister Loveland. So this is a letter. It's written on the same day, November the 1st. She says, has said before, the Lord showed me that the 1843 chart was directed by his hand. And then she says in this letter, God showed me the necessity of getting out a chart. What chart is she referring to? The 1850 chart. So she says that this chart of 1843 was directed by his hand. And God has also shown her the need of putting out another chart. This is the 1850 chart. So 1850, the beginning of a gathering time. And how does that work out for them? In 1863, what happens to God's people? They're scattered again. Two things happen in 1863. The first one is the organisation of the church. Was that good or bad? Does anyone say it was bad? Good. Because otherwise we could spend the rest of the class on quotes where she says about the necessity of this organisation. People in our history, they were afraid of organisation. They said that organisation would make them like Babylon. And she said the only thing that's like Babylon is disorder. And she said right now we're in such a disorganised state that we are like Babel. We are like Babylon because we are not organised. So organisation was a positive. What else happened in 1863? The rejection of the prophetic message. Good or bad? Bad. So there's something good that happened. The good is the organisation. Something bad that happened. The bad is the rejection of the prophetic message. We're all okay with that. And with this apostasy, they go back into a time of scattering for how long? 126 years. This scattering for 1260, this scattering for a 126 until when? 1989. And what's going to happen? Raising up of a new messenger. Elder Jeff Pippinger. Within this time period of scattering, we have another point in time where God tries to gather his people. What history are we missing? 1888 history. So in 1888, there's another attempt. And what's the quarrel over in 1888? Raise your hand if you can. What's the quarrel over in 1888? Hey, brother. Righteousness by faith. So you have two sides that are at war. Who are those two people? Butler and Wagner. We know Jones is there, but we'll refer at the moment to just Butler and Wagner. Butler, what is his position within the church? Leadership. So he's in a position of leadership. Wagner? Position of leadership? No. Comparative, nobody. In opposition to the leadership of the church. Who was right in this history? Raise your hand. Who was right? Both. We all okay with that? Ellen White says, neither of them have all the light on the subject. So if neither of them have all the light, what does that imply? There's an issue here where neither of them have all the light on the subject. Wagner has issues, Butler has issues. And because of that, is this history successful to complete the work of the third angel? No. Prior to 1888, in 1886, Butler writes a book. Does anyone know what that book is called? It's an attack on the position of Wagner. Is that okay? So we have two histories. We have 1798, beginning the Alpha history of modern Israel. Comes to a disappointment in 1844 because it's a history of failure. In 1850, God still tries to finish the work, to regather his people. Instead, they go into apostasy. They reject the prophetic message in 1863. In Acts 27, what happens in 1863? The ship goes off course, but they do organize as a church, which we understand to be positive. It begins a 126 years of scattering. Within that period of scattering, you have the history of 1888 and this time period where they could have or were given the opportunity to again finish it under the message of Jones and Wagner. But they faced opposition from the leadership of the church. So there is a division, a war, civil war within the church between these two sides over justification by faith. 1886, 2 years before this General Conference session, Butler, the leader, writes a pamphlet attacking the position of Wagner. And because of this, the issues, both individually held by these two men and the internal civil war that results from it, they do not finish the work. We come down over 100 years later to 1989, when the regathering begins again. God again stretches out his hand to gather his people. Do we have any questions or thoughts on that one?
I want to know the name of the books that was written by Butler.
I will look for it. It's not in these notes. It's a long name. Sorry?
Is it the law in the book of Galatians? Something is book like that.
Yes, but it has a longer name than that. I know where to go. Can't find it right now. I'll find it before the next class. The law in the book of Galatians. I know that's part of it. I just thought it was longer than that, but it doesn't matter now. Well, I'll find it. That would be enough to find it anyway. So 1989, they enter another time period of gathering. So scattering, gathering, scattering, gathering. This is just a rough outline of the history of modern Israel. It's the history of this. Millerite to 144,000. So we understand that if Satan counterfeits, that this model must be what he counterfeits. In 1798, what's the condition of the papacy? So just as God's people begin to be gathered, what happens to the counterfeit? Scattered. Because this is a revision, I don't want to go into all the elements and proofs. But we teach that they came out of that scattering time in 1899. 1798, scattered. 1989, they begin to come out of that scattering time. They begin to be gathered. And who was raised up here? Pacelli. Eugenio Pacelli. Why were they scattered in 1798? Why was the papacy scattered in 1798? Sister, why were they scattered? Yes. But why? Why would he be taken captive? Who's punishing them? God? God is punishing them? Do it over here. We understand that in 1798 God's people were scattered. I'll go over and use this one we're more familiar with. We know 1863 they're scattered. So this is God's church. And remember before we had the two images of Daniel 2. There's the mountain and the statue. Got those two pictures. And we see them as the whole of the great controversy, from the war in heaven to the proxy war on earth. So we have God's church. And does God's church always do what he tells them to do? So God is their boss, and he tells them to do something. They have a set of tasks. When they stop doing those tasks, they go into apostasy. So in 1863, they're scattered. They're sent into captivity. Why do God's people go into captivity? Abominations. They have a boss. He tells them to do something. They don't do it. What's that called? My sister. Apostasy. When did they go into apostasy on this line? And would you mark their apostasy? Because you know they're being judged for something. God's people? Why would he judge them in 1863 for something that they did prior to 1798? Because he's tried to gather them in that history. So they've kind of been in apostasy here. God's people are in apostasy here. What is God telling William Miller to do? It's to give the first angel's message, yes? And he's doing that, isn't he? So God's people, even if you just want to call them William Miller, they're not in apostasy here. They're giving the message he told them to give. Does that make sense? So they're doing the task that he tells them to do from 1798. When do they go into apostasy? We marked it on the board. They have a message to give, don't they? A specific message. Does anyone else know the history of 1850? What do we mark beginning in 1850? The Laodicean condition. So it's in 1850 that we mark the apostasy. We're told that it's in the history of 1850 they go into the Laodicean condition. So if they're scattered in 1863, you must know that prior to 1863, somehow they've begun to disobey their boss. Does that make sense? (1850) apostasy, Laodicean condition. They're in rebellion to their boss. Does that make sense? Rebellion. So God's church has a boss. Their boss is God. He's asked them to fulfill a certain job function. In 1850, they go into the Laodicean condition, and what does that condition mean? Does anyone want to summarize that? Raise your hand. My brother. They go into the condition of worldliness. What does that look like? What does it look like to go into the condition of worldliness? Anyone? Brother Dennis. What does it look like to go into the condition of worldliness?
For the church or for the counterfeit?
For the church.
So worldliness is another word for Laodicea. So if you don't understand for the church, I would say it's fail to understand the message of time. It's rejection of a message of time. Because when you come to the history of 1850, they were required to understand time. As if I follow your structure, if you compare all the histories of gathering, God is going to gather his people through a message of time. So if they were to be in a gathering from 1850, they must have understood the message of time. But they reject the message, they do not understand the message of time, they go into a different condition.
Thank you. Anyone else? My brother?
It's just to remain in conservatism.
Sorry?
Rejecting to be liberal. One is conservatism.
In the history of 1850? What would be the conservatism?
God's people must have a message. There's a message that the church said to go to the people of the world and to do that work. But there was struggles which people are applying their past time prophecies and they forgot that they function.
So those that weren't reapplying time prophecies. Because those people who are reapplying time prophecies, they're not really in the movement by then. They're not part of this church. Brother.
I think the point we were trying to grab in there, that was prophecy. Take a look at it from 1798.
I just want this answered. What does worldliness mean?
Yeah, I was seeing that no need to actually defining that because I was seeing what the one which you were trying to drive.
What does worldliness mean? What does worldliness mean? Yeah. Rejection of a prophetic message. Brother Rogers.
I read from the book Early Writings, you have to things beyond the work of God, and now you have the people turning away their eyes from the work of God and looking into the world. Money, buying cars, and building houses. This is the context of the Egyptians.
Is there anything wrong with buying cars and houses and...
The problem is they're supposed to do the work of God, they've turned away the work of God to they are concentrating their interest more on the world than doing the work of God.
So you're saying they've become distracted by life? Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah. It's like
Brother Rogers, anything you want to add to that?
Within the context of the Egyptians.
To define worldliness. They're distracted by the normal functions of life, where they're not focusing their attention on the work that they're meant to be doing.
And I could add also that Laodicea could also mean buying into the theological concepts of the world.
And part of that, buying into the theological concepts of the world, which is what Brother Dennis referred us to. And to understand that, you took that from early writings. Which chapter? Sorry? Covetousness. So it's taking from early writings, chapter covetousness. You're familiar with that, sister? I heard someone's agreeing. You agree with this? Yes, you agree with this. When I look at worldliness, that's the definition I was looking for. You go to early writings in the chapter on covetousness. That's when she's discussing the later scene condition they were coming into in the history of 1850. And it's a history where they're placing importance on not necessarily wicked, but just the normal running affairs of life, where it's distracting them from fulfilling their job function. So the tasks God requires them to do become down here, and they're more interested in temporal prosperity. Does that make sense? So we know that in 1798, the papacy is scattered. It goes into captivity. So my sister, I forgot your name, sorry. Caroline. Sister Caroline, we're comparing and contrasting God's church and Satan's church. God's church has a boss. They rebel against him. They go into a worldly condition where they're more interested in their prosperity. Because of that, he punishes them and he sends them into captivity for 126 years in 1863. If we were to compare and contrast that, we know this history: 1863 captivity, 1798 captivity. So just work off the compare and contrast. God was punishing his church for rebelling against his authority. And you said before that God was punishing the papacy. Satan was, do you see the power of a compare and contrast? It gives you information that isn't readily available. So 1798, they go into captivity. When do you think they choose worldliness? Yes, 25 years before, in 1773. Now, they're given a choice here. The kings of Europe come to them and they said, you can have your lands, you can have all these territories that we've taken from you, we'll give it all back, you can have it back, as long as you abolish the Jesuit order. They choose the land. What are they choosing? Sister. They chose worldly prosperity instead of accomplishing their work. So they're in rebellion to their boss. So God's people were in rebellion, apostasy. They went into a Laodicean condition of worldliness, distracted by temporal prosperity to the detriment of their job function. Satan's church, they went into rebellion, apostasy. They chose temporal prosperity over fulfilling their job function. And who fulfills their job function? The Jesuits. So the Jesuits fulfilled the job function of the papacy. Can we see that? They abolished the Jesuit order, chose temporal prosperity over fulfilling their job function, and then they're punished by their boss. Do you have any thoughts and questions with that?
I was trying to think that if you have the aspect, the mindset of the seven churches, when you come to 1863, on one aspect you can also see that it's the period of a scattering when God's church is scattered. You know it's in the dispensation of Lambert, but you can also see it's that the Atera, you have the scattering. And before you have the Atera, you have the church Pergamos, which is the church of compromise. So you argue for them to be scattered at 1863, they had to first compromise, which is the mark becoming Laodicea. Then you come to the second line of the counterfeit, and also arguing their version, for them to have been scattered, I would use the word also compromise.
Compromise.
Yeah.
Compromise is a good word. Catholic Church compromised, God's church compromised. I don't know the reference off the top of my head, but do we all know that verse that speaks about how God says, I've sent you my servants, my messengers, you've killed them with the sword, you've burnt them by fire. I keep sending you my messengers, you keep killing them. You all know those references. So who are the messengers for Satan's church? The Jesuits. So beginning from end, Jesuits were the messengers. The leadership didn't want them anymore, so they killed off the messengers that Satan sent them. Beginning from end, who finishes the work? Has to be the Jesuits. The Jesuits were the messengers originally. Satan's own church didn't want the messengers that he sent them, so they persecuted them, banished them, killed them. So when we come back to the end of the world, when the Catholic Church is no longer in rebellion to their boss, he's going to again send them messengers, yes? Alpha and Omega, beginning with the Jesuits, it will end with the Jesuits. Keep that in our minds. We'll close now. And we'll come back tomorrow. We'll just finish this reform line. Remember the compare and contrast. And remember, messengers were the Jesuits at the beginning, persecuted and killed by his church. They will be the messengers at the end. If you kneel with me, we will close in prayer. Sorry? Question? Yes?
Okay, like why are we still saying that the gospel is Satan's church? And I believe that the one that is going to do the work in this final generation is Protestant.
So why do we say the Catholic Church is going to do the work?
No, why we still consider it as Satan's church and we believe that Protestant is the one that can do the work?
You know that it was Satan's church in the 1260 was the papacy. You know that they went into captivity here.
Yeah, I understood that, but what I'm...
You see that they go into captivity here.
Yeah, I know that counterfeit, but what I mean...
So they're in captivity from 1899 to at least some point in the future.
That is not the point I'm talking
No, I'm leading you to my point. They're in captivity from 1899 to somewhere in the future. What's the condition of Protestantism in this time period?
No, like, this is what I need to ask now. Why are we not taking the homeland Protestantism?
I'm answering that, but you're not answering my questions. What's the condition of the Protestant church after 1899? Anyone else? My brother.
Come like mother. So they are in the same conditions as mother.
Same condition as the mother. The mother is in captivity.
Yeah, all of them also they are in captivity.
You think the daughters are in captivity?
Yeah.
The daughters are running riot in the United States. In 1863 in 1850 is the Catholic Church still in captivity? In 1850 is the papacy in captivity? No?
They are in captivity. Yes. Because their captivity ends in 1890.
Think about the internal condition of the Catholic Church. In 1869, they have all their papal states taken away. So from 1798 through to the 1900s, that is a whole century where piece by piece the kings of Europe are taking everything from the papacy. They still had their papal states under, what's his name? Napoleon. They still had power, they still had papal states, they still had certain degrees of authority. They're losing that over the course of 100 years. Look at 1869. Might even be 59. The Pope has to flee Italy. He isn't even safe in Rome anymore in 1859. So you know they're still in captivity. He has to place himself into exile from Rome. Just historically, they're in captivity in 1850. And yet what condition is Protestantism in? If Christ had have come back in 1863, who finishes the work? Protestantism. So were they in captivity? No. Who was being judged for slavery? Protestantism. So they were active, weren't they? Slavery was their fault. Ellen White says, the world's sin lies at the door of the Protestant churches. So they're active, the Protestant churches are active in 1850, 1863. They're not in captivity. 1888, the Catholic Church is still in captivity. 1889 is the First Vatican Council. Are they able to finish it? No, they have to cancel their First Vatican Council because they're under so much political pressure from the kings of Europe, it's not safe for them to meet. 1844, there are riots in the United States where thousands of Protestants pick up arms and attack and kill Catholics. They're not. So in 1889, you know the Catholic Church is still in captivity. They can't even meet under a First Vatican Council. How can they do anything when they can't even congregate and meet? So the Catholic Church is in captivity, but we know in the 1888 history, the Protestants are not in captivity. Christ could have come back in this history. There would have been a Sunday law in the United States, and who would have done that? Protestantism. So you know that when we're doing the line of a counterfeit, it can't be Protestantism. Does that make sense?
Does it mean Satan has two sides?
However you want to conceptuate a mother and daughters. Oh, brother.
Like when we see the line of in the lines of that line, in the lines of God's people, we see we have two God's people in two faces. We have the Millerites, and we have 144 hours. So the work is begun by the Millerites, and then that work failed, and it is going to be accomplished by 144 hours. The same problem, we bring it down. The works now, the church of Satan is also divided into two. There's Catholicism and then the Protestantism. The one is going to accomplish the works like 144 hours. That's how I
I also see that.
That's this model,
Yeah.
Alpha and Omega. But you know, in this Alpha history, when we talk about the resurrection of the papacy, this is not Protestantism. It can't be. Certainly not when we come into anywhere from 1798, 1844, 1850, because they go into captivity in 1798. Protestantism is just beginning to do their work. We'll close now. We'll come back and discuss this tomorrow if you'll kneel with me. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. Thank you, Lord, for the power of this methodology. We know that we still have questions, many questions, much to understand and discover. Lord, I pray that you will guide us through your methods to a common understanding of these subjects. May we understand the work you're doing in your movement. May we also be able to trace the work of the enemy and understand what we're up against, the forces that we face in the world, Lord, that we must counteract. I pray, Lord, that you'll be with us through the rest of today. In Jesus' name, amen.